So what you're looking at now is a woodcut from the 1850s. It's slaves probably in Louisiana or East Texas. Um, and one of the things I want you to notice, the slaves are picking the cotton. Notice it's both male and female. And the white master keeping an eye on them. And what's probably not quite accurate about this picture is the masters would actually hire overseers who were often quite brutal to keep to work slaves. The master, unless they were poor white, that didn't have a lot of money to hire an overseer. If you had money, you'd hire an overseer, which were quite brutal. They were the ones that created these systems of labor, that organized the slave labor, that made sure that the slaves were picking the quota of cotton that were set for them during this tense period of harvest. So I want to talk about slave punishment now, and kind of talk a little bit about an issue that I started talking about in the last podcast, and this idea that slavery was a system that was built on violence. Texas slaves and slaves all over the South had to live daily with the possibility of physical punishment. State law permitted masters to demand, and quote, obedience and submission from slaves. Obedience and submission. Whippings were the most common form of punishment for offenses. Whippings that were both incredibly painful and also humiliating for the slave. So slaves could be whipped for fighting, for running away, for insolence, for unsatisfactory work. Honestly, slaves could be whipped for any reason. They had no protection. They had no redress. There was no one that they could go talk to appeal. The slave master had complete say over the lives of slaves. And if the slave master wanted to whip a slave, the slave master had that, I'm calling it a right. Courts allowed slave masters complete control over the punishment of slaves. So slaves live under a situation where they know that a master can whip them at any time. In 1861, a man by the name of William Wilson in Harris County in the Houston area inflicted 600 lashes on a slave and killed the slave, basically whipped the slave to death. He was actually brought to trial for murder, but he was acquitted and he had to pay a fine. So here you have a white that whips a slave to death. Unusually he's brought to trial, but he's declared innocent and has to pay a fine. The Texas Supreme Court concluded that the punishment of slaves was left to the master's judgment, discretion, and humanity. Now, I do think it's true that there were some quote unquote humane slave owners. I don't think every slave owner was sadistic, but I think too often we focus on the exception rather than the system. And what you had is that you had a system that allowed slave masters to be sadistic if they wanted to. And they were always under the temptation. They knew if they wanted to whip a slave that they could whip a slave. So sure, there might have been a percentage of slave owners that were humane, but they're working in a system that allowed for masters to punish their slaves at will. So punishment was left to the master's judgment, discretion, and humanity. And every slaves had a grapevine. Slaves talked to each other. There was communication among slaves, and everyone knew who the masters were that were relatively humane and who were sadistic. And I want to move now to slave resistance. And what we know now is that slaves had a number of ways of resisting the situation that they were in. They weren't just passive victims of this system. We know now, for instance, that slaves created families, that they knew who their children were, so that slaves, although they're in a very, very tough spot, there were certain forms of resistance that we're able to pinpoint. And the reason we know this is that we have accounts of slaves that ran away. Not very many accounts of slaves that ran away from Texas, because most of those slaves disappeared into Mexico. But we have slaves that ran away from Louisiana, or 12 years of slave. Actually, he didn't run away. He was a free black man that had been kidnapped and brought into slavery, and then he was ultimately released. So he wasn't a runaway, but he spent 12 years as a slave, and he talked about his experience. But we also do have records of slaves that did run away, that wrote about their accounts of slavery and the evils of slavery. So, but before I get into that, I just want to let you know that it was very, very hard for slaves to revolt violently. A lot of students say, well, why did slaves put up with it? Why didn't they kill their master? Why didn't they stage revolts? You know, some slaves did kill their masters, actually. But what you have to realize is slaves didn't have guns. They're kept under very, very tight surveillance. They can't walk down a road without a pass signed by their master that gives them explicit permission to be walking in public spaces. Any white person could stop a slave for any reason and inquire what they were doing. So the slaves, the slaveholders are militant. They're well armed. They're organized. There were slave patrols that used to ride the roads at night, that were designed to disrupt any kind of slave uprisings, also to capture any runaway slaves. Also, if there was if you killed a master, or if you ran away, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, your family could be punished. So, long story short, slaves were in no position really to revolt against their masters, to have armed revolts against their masters. You did have some armed revolts in places like Virginia. The Nat Turner Rebellion of the 1830s is the most famous slave revolt. 60 whites were killed during that revolt. But after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1830s, slaveholders, including slaveholders in Texas, began to watch their slaves even more carefully, because slaveholders were super paranoid that slaves were going to revolt and that they were going to kill them. So slaveholders are keeping slaves under very close eye. Slaves don't have weapons. They don't have guns. There are slave patrols constantly keeping an eye out for slaves that are walking on public roads. And it was just an impossible situation for slaves to stage revolts. So how they resisted was in different ways, which I'll talk about in the next podcast.